Night had already fallen when the order finally came down. Iran had launched a massive wave of ballistic missiles across the region. Intelligence satellites and radar networks quickly tracked the launch sites. Within hours, U.S. command made a decision that would set a powerful response in motion. The targets were clear. Deep inside Iran, heavily protected underground bunkers were storing long-range ballistic missiles. Destroying them would require precision, stealth, and aircraft capable of penetrating some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Only one bomber was perfect for the job: the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. At a quiet American airbase, the message reached the maintenance crews just after sunset. There was no dramatic announcement, no loud alarms, just a few words passed through secure channels. The mission was on. Within minutes, the calm of the base disappeared. Hangar doors began sliding open as crews rushed to their assigned aircraft. The massive black flying wing bombers slowly emerged from their shelters, their dark surfaces reflecting the floodlights of the airfield. There was very little time. Ground crews moved with practiced precision. Tow vehicles pulled the bombers onto the tarmac while fuel trucks rolled into position beside them. Thick hoses were dragged across the concrete and connected to the aircraft. Each B-2 could carry nearly 167.000 pounds of fuel. But even that enormous amount wouldn't be enough for the journey ahead. The bombers were about to fly one of the longest and most demanding missions imaginable. They would cross oceans, refuel multiple times in the air, penetrate hostile territory, strike their targets, and then return home. And everything had to be prepared before dawn. Under the harsh white lights of the airfield, the night shift turned into a race against time. Fuel pumps roared to life. Heavy hoses were dragged from aircraft to aircraft. Gauges were checked constantly as thousands of pounds of fuel flowed into the bombers' tanks. The crews barely spoke. Everyone already knew what was coming. Because when the B-2s launch at night, it usually means something big is about to happen. While the ground crews worked through the cold night, another group inside the base was preparing in complete silence. The pilots. Inside the briefing room, the lights were dim. A large digital map filled the wall, showing the route stretching across oceans and hostile airspace. Red markers indicated the targets, underground missile bunkers buried deep inside Iran. The mission would be long. Very long. From takeoff to landing, the pilots could spend over 30 hours inside the cockpit. Every phase of the mission required perfect coordination, long-distance navigation, multiple aerial refuelings, stealth penetration, precision strike, and a safe return across thousands of miles. There would be no room for mistakes. Yet the atmosphere in the room was calm. B-2 pilots are trained for exactly this kind of operation. Many of them had flown missions just as complex before. They listened carefully as intelligence officers explained the target layout, air defense systems, and potential threats along the route. Satellite images flashed across the screen. Missile storage bunkers, radar installations, surface-to-air missile sites. Each one was studied carefully. After the briefing ended, the pilots moved to the preparation room. They began putting on their gear piece by piece. Flight suits, G-suits, survival vests, communication systems, helmets and oxygen masks. Everything was checked twice. Some pilots talked quietly with their partners. Others simply focused on their equipment. Despite the seriousness of the mission, there was no rush. Years of training had taught them that calm preparation was far more important than speed. Outside the building, the airfield was still alive with activity. Fuel trucks continued to move between aircraft. Portable pumps were dragged across the tarmac as crews connected and disconnected hoses again and again. The stealth bombers stood silently in the darkness, their massive wings stretching across the runway, waiting. Because when dawn arrived, they would leave the ground and begin a journey that could reshape the battlefield thousands of miles away. The B-2 bombers would not be flying alone. A mission of this scale required layers of protection. Long before the bombers even reached hostile airspace, a network of escort aircraft had already been assigned to the operation. Among them were some of the most advanced fighters in the world. F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters and AV-8B Harrier II jets, aircraft famous for their ability to operate from forward bases and aircraft carriers. Their job was simple but critical: protect the bombers at all costs. At another section of the airbase, Fighter pilots began preparing their own aircraft. Ground crews rolled ladders into place as the pilots climbed into the cockpits one by one. The routine was familiar. Seat harness secured. Helmet connected. Oxygen system tested. Navigation systems online. Inside the cockpits, dozens of screens lit up as the aircraft powered on. The quiet hum of electronics filled the canopy while technicians outside completed the final inspections. Meanwhile, the B-2 bombers had finished fueling. Their dark wings stretched across the tarmac like shadows under the runway lights. The aircraft looked almost unreal, smooth, silent, and designed to disappear from enemy radar. Just before dawn, the final clearance came through. Engines began to start. Deep inside the B-2, the pilots powered up the systems and ran through their checklists. Outside, the escort fighters taxied toward the runway, their navigation lights blinking in the early morning darkness. One by one, the aircraft moved into position. First the fighters, then the bombers. The runway stretched ahead into the dim horizon as the engines roared louder. The mission had begun. The first light of dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon. A thin line of orange appeared behind the mountains as the airbase prepared for departure. The runway lights still burned brightly, cutting through the early morning mist that hung over the airfield. At the far end of the runway, the first fighter jet rolled into position. Inside the cockpit, the pilot pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared to life, sending waves of heat rippling across the concrete behind the aircraft. The jet accelerated rapidly down the runway before lifting smoothly into the sky. Another fighter followed. Then another. Within minutes, several escort fighters were already climbing through the morning air, circling above the base as they waited for the bombers to join them. Back on the ground, the B-2 Spirit bombers slowly moved forward. The aircraft looked enormous as they rolled across the taxiway. Their wide flying wing design made them appear almost alien under the runway lights. Ground crew members stepped aside as the bombers approached the runway threshold. Each bomber paused for a moment. Final checks. Navigation systems. Fuel levels. Weapons status. Then the engines powered up. The deep rumble of 4 turbofan engines filled the air as the first B-2 began its takeoff roll. Slowly at first, the massive aircraft started accelerating down the runway. Faster. Faster. Until finally the huge flying wing lifted gracefully into the sky. One by one, the remaining bombers followed. Within minutes, the entire strike package was airborne. High above the airbase, the fighters moved into formation. The B-2 bombers took position at the center while the escort aircraft spread out around them, forming a protective shield. Together, the formation turned east. Ahead of them lay thousands of miles of ocean, multiple aerial refueling operations, and eventually one of the most heavily defended regions in the world. But for now, the aircraft climbed steadily through the early morning sky. The mission had officially begun. Hours passed as the strike formation continued its long journey east. Far below them stretched nothing but open ocean. The aircraft maintained their altitude and formation while the pilots monitored fuel levels, navigation systems, and communication channels. The bombers were built for long missions. But even the massive fuel tanks of the B-2 Spirit could not carry enough fuel for the entire trip. Soon, the first rendezvous point approached. On the pilot's radar screens, a new signal appeared ahead. A KC-135 aerial refueling tanker was already waiting. The tanker aircraft had taken off hours earlier to position itself along the planned route. Flying at high altitude, it maintained a steady speed while the strike formation slowly closed the distance behind it. Inside the cockpit of the B-2, the pilots carefully adjusted their course. Refueling in midair is one of the most delicate operations in aviation. The bomber must approach the tanker from behind and align itself with perfect precision. Too close, and the aircraft risks collision. Too far, and the boom cannot connect. Slowly, the massive bomber moved into position behind the tanker. Above the rear of the tanker aircraft, the boom operator lay inside a narrow observation window, guiding the refueling boom using small control sticks. From the B-2 cockpit, the tanker looked enormous. The bomber edged closer. Closer. Then the boom operator lowered the long refueling boom toward the aircraft. With careful movements, the boom was guided toward a small receptacle located on the top of the B-2's fuselage. A moment later, Connection. Fuel immediately began flowing through the boom into the bomber's tanks. Thousands of pounds of fuel transferred in just a few minutes while both aircraft continued flying at high speed. The two aircraft looked almost frozen in the sky as they remained locked together. Finally, the tanks were full. The boom disconnected. The B-2 slowly drifted away from the tanker and returned to formation with the other aircraft. But this would not be the last time. Before reaching the target area, the bombers would repeat this entire process several more times. Because the journey to the target was only halfway complete. The most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead, while the B-2 bombers continued their long journey across the ocean. Preparations were also underway thousands of miles away in the Middle East. At an Allied military base in the desert, the sun had already risen. The heat was beginning to build across the endless stretch of sand surrounding the airfield. Rows of helicopters stood lined up along the runway, their rotors still motionless as ground crews moved quickly between them. Fuel trucks rolled into place beside each aircraft. Thick hoses were connected as aviation fuel began flowing into the tanks of transport and attack helicopters preparing for deployment. The mission here was different from the bombers flying toward Iran. These helicopters were about to carry soldiers to a forward operating position near the border. One by one, soldiers assembled near the aircraft. They stood in tight columns wearing full combat gear, body armor, helmets, rifles, ammunition packs, and heavy backpacks filled with equipment. Some carried additional crates containing communications devices and medical supplies. A signal was given. The soldiers began boarding. They moved quickly up the rear ramps of the transport helicopters, filling the cargo bays while crew chiefs directed them into position. Weapons were secured, packs were stacked along the walls, and cargo straps were tightened around large crates of supplies. The helicopters were not only carrying troops. Inside the cargo compartments were ammunition boxes, spare parts, medical kits, and field equipment needed to establish a temporary base once they reached their destination. Outside, the final preparations were nearly complete. The pilots climbed into their cockpits and started their engines. One by one, the helicopter rotors began spinning, slowly at first, then faster until the blades blurred into circles above the aircraft. Dust and sand exploded into the air around the runway. A few moments later, the first helicopter lifted off the ground. Then another. And another. The formation climbed into the bright desert sky before turning toward their destination. Within the hour, they would arrive at an empty stretch of desert that would soon become a fully operational forward base. Because while the bombers were flying toward their targets, an entire force on the ground was preparing for what might come next. Less than an hour later, the helicopter formation reached its destination. Below them was nothing but empty desert. No buildings, no roads, no sign of human activity, just endless sand stretching toward the horizon. But that was about to change. The helicopters began descending one by one, kicking up massive clouds of dust as their rotors pushed against the ground. Visibility dropped instantly as sand filled the air around the landing zone. The moment the first helicopter touched down, the rear ramp dropped open. Soldiers rushed out immediately. They moved quickly but with discipline, spreading out across the landing area while others began unloading cargo from the helicopters. Heavy crates of ammunition, communication equipment, and supplies were passed from hand to hand onto the ground. The helicopters did not stay long. As soon as their cargo was unloaded, they lifted back into the air again, heading away from the landing zone to prepare for another run. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the ground began transforming the empty desert into a functioning military base. Tents were erected within minutes. Engineers unpacked portable generators and communication systems, quickly assembling satellite antennas that would link the new position with command centers hundreds of miles away. Other soldiers began digging defensive positions around the perimeter. Shovels cut into the dry desert soil as fighting positions slowly took shape. Machine gun posts were established, observation points were placed on higher ground, and a defensive ring began forming around the temporary base. Crates of ammunition were stacked in organized rows. Medical tents were set up. Supply areas were marked. Within only a few hours, the once empty patch of desert had transformed into a fully operational forward operating base. Weapons were ready. Communications were active. Defenses were established. And everyone knew that this base existed for one reason: to support the operation that was now unfolding in the skies far above them. Because while soldiers were securing the ground, the B-2 bombers were getting closer and closer to Iranian airspace. High above the clouds, the formation continued its long journey east. The hours inside the cockpit had begun to blur together. The pilots had already completed several aerial refueling operations, each one carefully executed thousands of miles from home. But now, the atmosphere inside the aircraft was beginning to change, because the next phase of the mission was approaching. On the navigation display inside the B-2 cockpit, a new line appeared on the map, the boundary of Iranian airspace. Beyond that line, the environment would become far more dangerous. Iran operates a network of long-range radar stations, surface-to-air missile systems, and interceptor aircraft designed specifically to detect and destroy intruding aircraft. Any conventional bomber would face enormous risk entering that zone. But the B-2 was not a conventional bomber. Its flying wing design, radar-absorbing materials, and carefully engineered shape allow it to appear almost invisible on enemy radar screens. Instead of a large aircraft signature, the B-2 often appears as nothing more than a small radar reflection, sometimes mistaken for background noise. Even so, the pilots remained focused. Stealth does not mean invincible. The escort fighters began spreading out further across the formation, creating a wider protective screen as the aircraft approached the most sensitive portion of the route. Inside the B-2 cockpit, the pilots reviewed the strike plan once again. Target coordinates, approach angle, release timing, exit route. Every step had been calculated long before the aircraft even left the ground. Now it was simply a matter of executing the plan with perfect timing. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky was beginning to darken again as evening approached. Thousands of miles behind them, the airbase where they had taken off was now half a world away. Ahead of them waited the target, the underground missile bunkers. The aircraft quietly adjusted course and began descending slightly, positioning themselves for the final phase of the operation. Soon, the bomb bay doors would open, and the mission would reach its most critical moment. Night had fallen again by the time the bombers reached the target zone. From high altitude, the land below appeared dark and silent. Mountains stretched across the landscape, broken only by small clusters of lights from distant towns. But hidden beneath the ground were the real targets. Deep underground missile bunkers. Intelligence satellites had spent months mapping the exact locations of these facilities. Buried beneath reinforced concrete and layers of rock, the bunkers were designed to protect Iran's ballistic missiles from airstrikes. Destroying them required precision. Inside the cockpit of the B-2, the pilots watched their navigation displays closely. The aircraft had now entered the final approach phase. Every movement had to be exact. The bomber adjusted its course slightly, lining up with the strike corridor calculated during mission planning. The aircraft remained nearly invisible to radar as it moved silently across the night sky. Below them, Iranian radar stations continued scanning the skies. But the stealth bomber slipped through the detection network like a shadow. Inside the aircraft, the targeting system confirmed the coordinates. The moment had arrived. The bomb bay doors slowly opened beneath the massive flying wing. Cold air rushed through the compartment as the weapon release system activated. A few seconds later, the bombs dropped. Massive bunker-busting weapons fell silently through the darkness, guided precisely toward the underground missile storage facilities below. Seconds later, the ground erupted. Huge explosions tore through the bunkers as the bombs penetrated deep into the reinforced structures before detonating. Fire and debris blasted upward from the mountainside as the strike hit its targets. The underground missile storage complex was destroyed. Inside the B-2 cockpit, the pilots did not celebrate. There was still work to do. The bomb bay doors closed, and the aircraft immediately turned onto its exit route. The bomber climbed back to altitude and accelerated away from the target area, disappearing once again into the darkness. Behind them, the strike zone burned, and the long journey home had just begun. Moments after the strike, the B-2 bombers were already turning away from the target area. Inside the cockpit, the pilots followed the pre-planned escape route exactly as briefed. The aircraft climbed back to cruising altitude, moving quickly away from the mountains where the explosions had just lit up the night. There was no time to watch the damage. The most important objective now was getting out safely. Even though the strike had been successful, the bombers were still flying through a region filled with radar systems and air defenses. Any delay could give the enemy time to respond. The escort fighters immediately tightened their protective positions around the bombers. Sensors scanned the sky for potential threats while communication channels remained quiet and disciplined. The entire formation moved as one unit, heading back toward international airspace. Several minutes later, the aircraft crossed the boundary. They were out. Only then did the tension inside the cockpits begin to ease slightly. But the mission was far from over. The return flight would take many more hours, including several additional aerial refueling operations across the ocean. One by one, the bombers again rendezvoused with tanker aircraft waiting along the route. Fuel transferred. Boom disconnected. Formation reassembled. The process repeated again and again as the aircraft continued the long trip back toward their home base. By the time the formation finally approached the American airfield, nearly an entire day had passed since the bombers first left the ground. The runway lights appeared in the distance. One by one, the aircraft descended toward the base. The first B-2 touched down smoothly, rolling along the runway before slowing to a stop. The remaining bombers followed shortly after, returning safely from one of the longest and most complex missions modern airpower can perform. On the ground, maintenance crews were already waiting. Engines shut down. Cockpits opened. The pilots climbed down from the aircraft, exhausted but calm. The mission was complete. Thousands of miles away, the destroyed missile bunkers would reshape the strategic situation in the region. But here at the airbase, the night returned to silence. The B-2 bombers were once again resting in their hangars, waiting for the next mission.